The French Canadians were the second group of immigrants who came in large numbers to Newburyport. Unlike the Irish, who came to stay, the French Canadians fully intended, after earning enough money, to return to their farms in Canada's Quebec province. The language they spoke was at first an impediment to their acceptance by the community, as was their preference to keep to themselves. However, they arrived in Newburyport at a time when change was everywhere. Bicycles, automobiles, movie theaters, cotton mills, and shoe shops, to name a few, would soon come to play a part in the lives of everyone. Therefore, in telling their story tonight, it is appropriate to focus on two institutions which would have a huge influence on the French Canadians who came to Newburyport. Those two institutions were the Roman Catholic Church, St. Louis de Gonzaga, at the corner of Federal and Quebec Streets, where they worshipped, and the large number of shoe manufacturing shops throughout the city, where they worked. In both of these places, the church and the shoe shops, the French Canadians built for themselves a robust social life that went far beyond the primary purpose of those institutions. By the end of the 20th century, the church and the school they loved so much were closed, and the shoe industry gradually disappeared. However, like the other immigrant groups before and after them, as time went on, the French Canadians made significant contributions to the betterment of our city and are still making them today. This is their story, the second chapter, if you will, in the story of immigrants in Newburyport. We hope you enjoy it.
Alouette, je te plumerai.
The French Canadians. The second largest group of immigrants to come to Newburyport after the Irish was the French Canadians, who started coming in large numbers between 1890 and 1900. It was not only the second largest group to impose itself on a basic Yankee culture, but also the first foreign language group to impose itself on the English-speaking culture. The French Canadians arrived tentatively at first. They were largely farmers, young men, fathers as well as single men, coming to test the waters beginning around 1880. Tending the farms of the St. Lawrence Valley was hard work with little hope for the future, and the railroads had opened up opportunity to the south. Word spread that cash crops were waiting for those who wanted to work in the mills and shops. Some came down as soon as the crops were in, stayed through the winter, and returned home with money in their pockets. Word spread of the opportunities, and gradually they settled in and sent for their families. They, like the Irish, were closely affiliated with the Roman Catholic Church. The French Canadians differed from other groups in that they settled in Newburyport with the intention of returning ultimately to Quebec. The fact that Quebec was only a few hundred miles from Newburyport slowed the pace of the group's adaptation to a new social system. More than any other group, they tried hard to retain their national identity by perpetuating the traditional French-Canadian family patriarchal society. Newburyport and the new life proved to be, however, a mixed blessing. Most of the French families had come from villages where their churches and parishes were the center of their lives. They attended the Church of the Immaculate Conception, where Holy Mass was familiar enough in those days, as Latin was the common tongue of the teaching and worship of the Church. But the sacrament of confession was possible only on limited occasions, with a traveling French-speaking priest, and socializing with those who did not speak French was all but impossible. By 1894, the French Canadians in Newburyport were represented by 60 families who worshipped at the Immaculate Conception Church. At that time, the church appointed a French curate to help. The effort fell far short, however, of what the French parishioners had known at home. They longed for the warmth and fraternity that comes from the comfort of a common tongue, their own organizations rooted in their parishes, and the social as well as the spiritual fruits of easy and friendly relationships. They wanted for themselves what the Irish had won for themselves, their own parish and their own church, where they would be free of the discomfort they knew as intruders. In 1900, the Baptist Church showed its desire to welcome immigrants by opening up on a Sunday afternoon in February for a service for French people. Reverend Papineau of New Bedford gave the sermon in French. By 1903, when there were 127 French-Canadian families, property for a French church was purchased on the corner of Federal and Beck Streets from the Presbyterian Church for a token $1. The land provided for a rectory, a site for the future church, and its own permanent pastor, Father Levesque. The church was dedicated on May 30th, 1905, with 40 clergymen in attendance. A French girl and an Irishman were said to be the first to be wedded in the church. The Immaculate Conception Parish had been fortunate to have early pastors who were not only strong religious leaders, but also businessmen with vision. So was St. Louis de Gonzague in the person of Father Levesque, who would remain as pastor for 15 years. In July 1906, the French Society acquired significant property from the Sewell Noyes estate that included a large 3-story frame house at the corner of Federal and Beck Streets and 2 large brick mansions on Federal Street for $9,600. The first mansion, known as the Eliezer Johnson Home at 19 Federal Street, was built about 1798 by William Bartlett, who established the city's textile industry. Its architectural features and staircase are considered among the finest in Newburyport. The second, the Porter Mansion at 17 Federal Street, had also been built in 1798. The brick barn in the rear of that property would be refurbished for a parochial school. The pastor moved into the new rectory in the Bartlett Johnson House. At the time of the purchase, the buildings were in disrepair and the parish spent a considerable amount to restore them to proper condition. What the French Canadians wanted, in addition, was a school in which their children could study both their religion and their language. In September 1907, the Sisters of St. Chrétien called their first classes to order in French and in English, so that bilingual education could provide the best of the two cultures for the young. In their school, basic subjects such as reading and literature, English, penmanship, arithmetic, music, American history, and geography were taught in English. In addition, 30 minutes each day was spent on religion, which was taught in French. In addition, the curriculum was supplemented with a study of French history and the French language. When later the Sisters of St. Chrétien were recalled, the pastor was able to obtain the services of the Sisters of St. John d'Arc. In 1928, these sisters, having been left a legacy by the Kessler family, and conscious of the great need in a city comprised of so many working poor, established on Lime Street a home for young working girls living apart from their families. They oversaw this home for 22 years. Like the Irish, the French-Canadian wives stayed subservient to their husbands, who took all responsibility for financial affairs. Neither men nor women had a voice in church affairs. Bound mostly by church-run organizations like the Married Ladies' Sodalities and the Holy Name Society, they seldom took part in community affairs. It goes without saying that in all the ethnic groups, the child was subservient to the parents. A boy's occupational status was the choice of the father, who decided which son inherited the farm, which son was to enter the priesthood, etc. In addition, the fact that the French Canadians were second only to the Irish in numbers lessened the need to interrelate with other ethnic groups, and thus slowed their social mobility. A very young child spoke, of course, the French-Canadian language of his parents. As he grew older, however, and played with the children of other ethnic groups, the child acquired English, which became his language outside the home. The French-Canadian parochial school in Newburyport was unsuccessful in its attempt to maintain the French language. In time, it would become a barrier between parents and their more modern offspring. In Canada, The incentive to work was primarily to provide for immediate subsistence. They lived from day to day, making enough to get by. Children were used to produce capital by sending them out to work at an early age, rather than investing in their education. The next generation, however, having its roots embedded in the American social and economic system, was more interested in maintaining a standard of living that conformed to the class with which they liked to identify. The French Canadians settled primarily in the south or east end of Newburyport near their church. By the 1930s, however, they had dispersed throughout the city. The Shampoo family epitomizes the story told here of the French Canadians. Born in Canada, Philippe and Rose Carrier Shampoo were married in Maine around 1890. They started a family immediately, and stopping a short time at each town, they moved from one mill town to another seeking a better way of life. One can trace their progress in the birth records of each town as they stopped, since several of the older children were born in a different town. Finally, they settled in Newburyport, where the family put down roots. Here they raised 9 children. It was about this time that the French church, St. Aloysius, was established, and it is here that they worshipped, and it was the French school that the children attended. The census of 1900 shows that they were literate and held jobs as factory operatives. Thus, at their arrival, they were already one step up on the occupational scale. As was typical of the French-Canadian family, Philippe's word was law. Discipline was harsh and readily administered. As each child reached the legal working age, he or she was put to work. In this family, the girls gravitated to the cotton mills and the boys to the shoe shops. All turned their salaries over to the father, who quit working. Each child was given a very small allowance. According to Philippe's daughters, it was a meager 10 cents. Even the mother worked in the mill, leaving those too young to work in charge of the very young children. Nor was Philippe one to stick too closely to the law. One girl at age 10 was big for her age, and according to her older sisters, Philippe paid the factory overseer to look the other way. She wasn't much of an asset. According to her sisters, she spent most of her time hiding in the bathroom. Years later, as they talked of earlier days, the girls, although they strongly criticized the harsh authoritarian rule of their father and complained of long hours in the mills, did not describe the mill as a sweatshop. One girl who ran a loom suffered an injury for which she was not compensated. That seemed almost to be accepted as the way things were. Surprisingly, one of the sisters, being quite frail, was singled out for lighter duties. Pictures of the mill and its workers showed a large number of girls with a few male supervisors. It seemed as though working in the mill was almost a way in which people socialized. The hours left little time for idle hands or entertainment. Thus, entertainment, when it came in the form of picnics, was much appreciated. The only release from this heavily structured home and work environment for the girls was marriage. Contacts at work and entertainment outside the church had speeded the Americanization process. 4 of the 5 Shampoo girls married Irishmen and took pride in the fact that, after their marriages, they never worked outside the home. All quickly lost their familiarity with the French language and French church as they became communicants at the so-called Irish Church, the Church of the Immaculate Conception. As for family ties, however, those remained strong. Most had only a few friends outside the family. Most of their socialization was within the family, and with such a large family, they felt no need for any other. Only at a much later age would any of them participate in community organizations. An interview with Rita York brought other interesting details about the French community. My father was born in St. Charles, Canada in 1889 and lived in Newburyport for 45 years. He served in the First World War, but he had to lie and say that he was born in Somersworth, New Hampshire, where several of his siblings were born. He was an active member of the Saint Jean de Baptiste and Holy Name Societies of the French Church. He was a wonderful father. My favorite remembrance is of him throwing up his hands when we disagreed and saying, "How can a man win with 4 women in the house?" This was far different from his father, my grandfather, who was a stern disciplinarian. He quit his job after the children went to work and let them support the family. My grandmother, however, was a sweet lady. One of my uncles was J.R. Rooster Thibault, who was a city councilor from 1912 to 1913. He was the first citizen of the French-Canadian community to serve in the Newburyport City Council. Later, he served on the Old Age Assistance Board and the City Welfare Board, as well as becoming a member of the Newburyport Lodge of the Elks and a charter member of the Neptunes Association. My mother's father served in World War I. An uncle was on the police force, but life was difficult because at that time the police force was filled with Irishmen, and a French Canadian was definitely not welcome. This was not unusual. There was quite a bit of friction between the two ethnic groups, with the French being called frogs or puddle jumpers, and the Irish being called harps. Despite the conflict between the Irish and the French, intermarriage became common in the second generation. One of my aunts, who was very pretty and petite, used to receive love letters in her pay envelope when she worked at the cotton mill. The paymaster was an Irishman who fell deeply in love with her. They eventually married. I guess you could say that love bridged the gulf between the French and the Irish. She was a very dutiful wife, leaving the French church to worship with him at the Immaculate Conception, a big step for someone from her family. She always supported the French church, however, and never cut her family ties. He treated her very well. The story is told that each night, before going to sleep, he would lean over and say, "Good night, my little French doll." She saved all his love notes from the mill and those he wrote in the following years. After her death, a relative put them all in a scrapbook to preserve their legacy. New Year's Day was very important to the French Canadians. Each child would kneel before his or her father for his blessing. There would be parties for friends the night before, and on New Year's Day, the whole extended family would meet at a chosen home.
The French Canadians, like other immigrants who followed them, were exposed to a much different lifestyle in Newburyport than they had experienced as simple farmers in Quebec province. And as Jean Doyle has noted in her introduction to this program, the late 19th century and early 20th century were periods of great inventions, innovation, and change. Immigrants to Newburyport during this time were introduced to many new inventions, such as bicycles, automobiles, airplanes, movies, and countless others. It is true that only the elite could afford to buy most of these new products in their early days, but that was to change. Bicycling reached fad status among the wealthy in the 1890s. Bicycle clubs sprang up in Newburyport as well as in most other New England cities. At the time, bicycles cost $100 or more, 3 to 6 months' salary for most working men and women. As the price of bicycles gradually decreased and the new horseless carriage continued to evolve, bicycles became available to a wider segment of the population, and the bicycle clubs began to disappear. People had been experimenting with automobiles since the 1860s. As far back as 1867, Francis Curtis, who was the superintendent of the Newburyport Gas Works, invented a steam engine which was attached to a piece of equipment. In the following year, Curtis built a car that could go 30 miles on a full load of coal with a half a dozen stops for water. During the testing period, Curtis aroused the wrath of his neighbors, one of whom swore out a warrant for his arrest. When the police officer arrived, Curtis left in his car with the officer in hot pursuit on foot, perhaps the first getaway car in American history. Curtis was never able to convince the Newburyport City Council of the wisdom of steam cars, and he never built another one. By 1900, 38% of the cars in the United States were powered by electricity, 40% were powered by steam, and 22% by gasoline. Of the three types of motor power, electric was the most favorable for easy starting and driving comfort. It was noiseless and emitted no noxious fumes, which made it the first choice among women and doctors. If one were wealthy enough to own two cars, one of them would usually be an electric. When the public demanded affordable automobiles for vacations and family use, the electric models began to lose favor to the cheaper gasoline-powered models that could drive a greater distance in a shorter time. Although the language of the French Canadians could sometimes be a barrier, there were many opportunities, at least for the men, to have a good time. This picture was taken in 1906, when the annual fair on Story Avenue was still a Newburyport institution. Thousands were attracted to the fair each year for the trotting races and exhibitions of cattle, poultry, and other attractions. This had particular appeal to the French Canadians, many of whom had left their farms in Canada for better jobs. Movies had become an important form of entertainment by 1907. The first movie theater in Newburyport was the Premiere. It opened on April 13, on a first floor in the upper corner of State and Essex Streets. In addition, the Theatre Comique opened that same month in one of the stores in the Music Hall block on Pleasant Street, and the Orpheum Theatre followed soon after. All offered afternoon and evening showings and a change of programs twice a week, along with the popcorn and the Cracker Jack. Another major theater, the Savoy, opened November 22, 1907, in Griffin Hall, on the third floor of the Griffin Building on Pleasant Street. Although Newburyport is considered a city, the smallest city in the Commonwealth, it is unique in that it is walkable from one end to another, from Story Avenue to Marlborough Street. On pleasant Sunday afternoons of days gone by, people went for walks and came to sit on the waterfront to watch the sailboat races sponsored by the nearby American Yacht Club. More exciting, however, were the one-man motorboat races. These swift-moving little boats would virtually fly over the water, bouncing in the air when they hit a wave or the wake of the speedboat ahead of them. Pioneers of New England aviation, W. Sterling Burgess and Augustus M. Herring, made national news between April and July of 1910 with biplane test flights on the dunes and marshes of Plum Island. These events were a tremendous step forward in American aviation. And speaking of Plum Island, those who liked to swim could enjoy the fun on their day off, swimming at the beaches of Plum Island. Language would not be a problem here. Women were limited in what they could do in those days, but many of them took advantage of picking blueberries in the many bushes behind what is now the Plum Island Airport. This, then, was the new world encountered by the French Canadians as they began coming to Newburyport in the 19th century. Norbert Valley was a French Canadian who immigrated from Canada and lived on Water Street. He and his family, including 8 children, depended on the Merrimack River for their livelihood. Valley netted sand eels to sell commercially as fishing bait. When the eels were abundant, Valley shipped them to markets in Boston's North End, where there was always a market for eels. In the summers, youths would vie with one another to be chosen to operate Valley's eel traps. Most important to the social life of the French Canadians, however, was their connection to the French church, Saint Louis de Gonzague, at the corner of Federal and Beck Street. Church activities took time and effort that necessitated many meetings and preparations that brought parishioners even closer together as a community as they strived to find the funds to build not only a church, but a school and a rectory as well. As a result, the early French Canadians who came to Newburyport rarely took part in any of the community activities around the city. They limited themselves to church-run organizations like the Married Ladies' Sodality and the Holy Name Society. News accounts of that period indicate that St. Louis parish groups held numerous fundraising, social, and cultural events, such as lawn parties, fairs, concerts, musicals, and plays. Each year, the parish would celebrate Father Levesque's birthday and the founding of the parish, which fell on the same date, March 19th. In 1909, a large class of 140 children received the sacrament of confirmation at St. Louis. By 1911, parish membership had reached 1,250. First Communion was a very special day for the children. For the first time, they would be able to receive the body and blood of Jesus, just as their parents had. The girls wore dresses and veils like little brides. The boys wore suits. Both received a missal and rosary beads to mark the occasion. Father Levesque was one of those larger-than-life men, and many wonderful stories were told about him. The late Bill Plant, a member of the St. Louis parish, recalled, quote, "Father was very successful in obtaining items for the many fundraisers held by the church. As he would enter a downtown store, Father would spy an item of interest and tell the storekeeper that he had had a dream the previous night, that he had come into the store to mention the upcoming fundraiser. The storekeeper would say, 'Why, Father, won't you please accept this clock or lamp or other article?' Most of the time, Father would leave with the desired item for his fundraiser. Father Levesque also drove one of the earliest automobiles in town. As he would drive down State Street, he would have one hand on the wheel with the other pumping on the horn or waving warnings to those in the streets to, quote, 'Get out of the way! Get out of the way!' The French community, like the rest of Newburyport, shared the burden and did its part in World War II. Ramona Drouin Foley talked about what it was like to have your father overseas. This picture shows Ramona's dad on the left at Normandy Beach with his buddies overlooking the English Channel landing sites. He sent home articles made from his parachute. Since Ramona's mother worked while her father was away at war, Ramona and the other girls lived with two of the nuns from the convent during the day. In 1952, the church celebrated its 50th anniversary. The picture on the sanctuary bore this message, quote, 'They shall make me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in the midst of them.' Boots Chenard, in one of his anecdotes, explained how different Sunday Masses were when he was growing up. Quote, 'The Mass was recited in Latin, and the sermon was in French. Whether French or Latin, it didn't matter to me, because I couldn't understand either. But it was a pleasure to be there. We had to fast after midnight if we were to receive communion on Sunday. Going to church then was very different than it is today. Everyone would get out their Sunday best clothing to wear. Men would wear a shirt and tie with a sports jacket. Our shoes would always be shined. And topping off the best of attire would be a soft hat. Ladies would be in a fine dress and coat, with their hair covered with a nice hat. They would have to wear a head covering for the Mass.' Joseph and Emma Richard became members of the St. Louis parish in 1914. They were refugees from the Great Salem Fire. All 8 of their children attended the St. Louis parochial school. They were active participants in many areas of the school and religious life of St. Louis. They made many friends there, and the parish community was a great part of their social life. Their grandson, Bob Richard, shared these memories of San Luis. Quote, I remember becoming an altar boy and all the Latin prayers I had to memorize. As I look back, it was quite an accomplishment. Learning the rituals of the Mass, studying religion in French and English, as well as other subjects. I also remember the many plays I was in, plus the choir. Looking back, life at San Luis was rigorous, rewarding, and fun. Still quoting Bob Richard, I remember Sister Gertrude, Sister Patricia, and Sister Alice Marie putting on ice skates and skating with us in the schoolyard skating rink at recess. What a joy it was to see the fun side of the good nuns. After school, we spent many hours playing with other French school kids on the school grounds. We played a lot of baseball, and many school windows were broken accidentally. My father had to replace many broken panes of glass, but he never complained. Wonderful memories of San Luis will always be vivid in my family's minds. Different memories for different generations. Since hockey was the leading sport in Canada, their homeland, it was only natural that hockey would be popular at the French school. Father Provost built a hockey rink behind the school in the 1940s. These were Canadians to whom hockey was the breath of life, and boys lived or died depending on the luck of the puck in their games against the boys from Amesbury. The rink closed later on in the 50s. Their beloved nuns having been called back to Canada, the French school itself was forced to close in 1965. The Richard children became part of the new way of life and moved away from Newburyport. Though the older generation resisted the change and deplored it, the young people, by and large, welcomed and embraced it. By 1977, when the church celebrated its 75th anniversary, it had undergone many changes. Many of the parishioners had clung to the belief that they were Canadian at heart and would return to their homeland someday. In the meantime, they believed they could insulate themselves and their children from the influences of the land they had come to temporarily by retaining their own language and culture intact. They did not foresee the pull of the new way of life, one much freer from the constraints of parental domination, with many more opportunities for education, jobs, and better living conditions than they had known in Canada. In 1995, the church celebrated its 90th anniversary, with Bill Plant as the main speaker. The words on the bulletin created for that day said it all. Quote, let us gather as God's family and rejoice in this joyous celebration. A few short years after that celebration, the church closed. So as we can see, the French church at the corner of Beck and Federal Streets played a dominant role in the history of the French Canadians in Newburyport. Spiritually, San Luis was a place where they could worship together in their own native language, hear sermons in French, and make their confessions to a French-speaking priest. And also important, from a social or lifestyle point of view, the church provided them with something they very much needed, a place to go where they could interact socially with their friends, relatives, and neighbors in a cordial and welcoming environment, which, it must be added, was not always easily found elsewhere in the city in those days.
Shoe manufacturing was the main industry in Newburyport for the better part of a century, employing thousands, sustaining the local economy, and populating the downtown with 4- and 5-story factories. By the 1850s, shoemakers were sprouting up in Newburyport like dandelions. Robert Couch Jr. and Company made children's shoes and slippers for 5 years, employing 150 and boasting a payroll of $500 to $600 a week. Jacob T. Rowe employed 25 hands and generated revenues of $20,000. That's $612,000 today. Seth Chase made soles and other shoe parts in a facility on Prince Place, where one of the largest shoe factories in Newburyport would soon rise. The factory still stands today, but exchanged its roots for other industries after shoemaking disappeared, and today houses million-dollar condominiums. Until the Civil War, shoes were crude, straight, and presumably terribly uncomfortable by today's standards. Left and right shoes eventually caught on with men's and then women's as styles and advanced manufacturing methods gained in importance. Mass production of shoes and boots didn't begin in earnest until the soon-to-be preeminent Dodge shoemaking family came to town, led by Elisha Perkins Dodge. Elisha saw the future and began what was soon to be mass production of shoes. Born October 5, 1847 in Ipswich, Elisha, at age 16, followed brothers Nathan D., John L., my great-great-grandfather, and Moses to Troy, New York, and started out as a survey assistant for the Catskills and Schenectady Railroad, according to Nathan D. Withington in the 1903 biography about Elisha. After a year on the railroad, he joined his brothers as a shoe cutter. Brothers John L. and Nathan D. wanted to start manufacturing in Lynn, Massachusetts, where they briefly operated on a small scale. Given that lenders were more accommodating in Newburyport, the brothers moved here in 1866. On September 1, 1866, N.D. Dodge went into partnership with John H. Balch and established the business over the First National Bank, their creditor, Elisha working on salary as a cutter. He was remarkably quick and expert, and it is told of him that he in 3 hours cut 60 pairs of Balmorals. He also did a large share of the bookkeeping, Nathan attending to the selling, wrote Withington. Elisha was off and running. In late 1867, he took over the business with partner Newell Danforth. With some ups and downs, the business took off, with various partners taken to the business until 1875, when Henry B. Little was brought in as partner until 1899. Elisha controlled the business and its offshoots under various names, such as E.P. Dodge and Company, Newburyport Shoe Company, and N.D. Dodge and Bliss. By 1880, Dodge and his brother Nathan owned the largest shoe factory in the world, according to the Newburyport News. Between 1873 and 1902, the year of his death, his company racked up more than $30 million in sales of women's shoes. That's $825 million today. His large factory at 21 Pleasant Street hummed with machinery, including the revolutionary Mackay Stitcher, which could turn out 200 pairs of shoes a day, and as it was refined by United Shoe Machinery, 1,200 pairs a day by 1960. According to the paper Cordwainer, that's a shoemaker, delivered by Milton L. Dodge on April 4, 1961, to the Tuesday Night Club, a group of prominent male Newburyporters who met every other week to eat, drink, and discuss the issues of the day. Milton was John L.'s grandson and my grandfather. He was awarded numerous patents following his passion for inventing machines rather than manufacturing shoes. By 1874, 6 boot and shoe manufacturers were operating in Newburyport, with the Dodgers joined by E.K. Batchelder at 314 High Street, John D. Pike at 268 High, Jacob T. Rowe at 285 and a half High Street, and W.N. Spinney at 10 Middle Street. The number grew to 9 by 1884 and 1885, and there were 11 boot and shoemakers, suggesting handmade footwear was still viable. Cottage industries were starting to spring up under the directory headings boot and shoe machinery and boot and shoe stock, according to the Newburyport directories issued annually. The late 1800s and the early 20th century constituted the golden age of local shoe manufacturing startups, according to the Massachusetts History of Industries 1930 edition. At its peak, shoe concerns in Newburyport employed upward of 3,000 operatives, as the Massachusetts History of Industries called workers. Many of the operatives were French Canadians who had left the farms in Quebec to work in the textile mills and shoe factories of Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. Working in the shoe factories was a major upgrade to their lowly status in the pecking order of America's newly arrived inhabitants. Indeed, few could speak English, which put them at a disadvantage to, say, the Irish, who were more inclined to make demands on their Newburyport shoe bosses. Here's a rundown of a few of those bosses. Bliss & Perry was incorporated in 1892 by Charles A. Bliss and Nathan D. Dodge. Walter I. Perry was shortly thereafter brought into the business. It became Dodge Bliss & Perry in 1907 and was known for an inexpensive line of women's slippers and eventually women's shoes. Others associated with the firm were George H. Bliss, Donald I. Perry, Herbert E. Harriman, and Norman P. Merrill. It employed 400 at its peak. Daniel S. Burley and William R. Usher started their namesake firm in 1891. 8 years later, it became Burley & Stevens. In April 1894, Harry M. Husk Company started up and eventually employed 400 operatives. In 1906, George A. Leonard began operation as a partnership with Roger Sherman Jr. and Andrew Rofe. Leonard eventually took over the business with 350 operatives, turning out 2,500 pairs of shoes a day. Smaller concerns include the Baby Shoe Company, owned by John S. Norton and Louis J. Festo, made soft-soled shoes for infants. The Custom Heel Company employed 50 operatives, with J. F. Pollard as president. The Maplewood Heel Company produced, unsurprisingly, heels. The president was Fred W. Mears, and treasurer was Halsey E. Abbey. The Fern Company, with Oscar Fern as president, made women's shoes and employed 175 to 200 operatives. Fern & Poor employed 125 and made women's shoes. W. D. Hanna employed 300 in the production of shoes. Lowell Thomas Shoe Company made women's shoes with Harry B. Thomas as president, William P. Lowell Sr. as treasurer, and William Lowell Jr. as secretary. The R.E. Welch Shoe Company, owned by Richard E. Welch, employed 75. These companies required skilled and unskilled laborers, and the Franco-Americans gladly fulfilled that need. The major immigration of Franco-Americans dovetailed with the rise of the shoe industry in Newburyport. And I quote, "Many young Frenchmen and women would come south by rail to work in the mills, earn cash, and sometimes return to the family farm in summer. It was said that they were seeking streets paved with gold. Many stayed. The French were slower to assimilate in Newburyport society than the Irish because they continued to speak French at work and in their social lives. Franco-Americans were active in French societies, but most were not politically prominent, according to a 2014 article in the Newburyport News by Dyke Hendrickson, who also wrote Quiet Presence, a book about Franco-Americans assimilating into American society. As the 19th century wound down, the shoe industry kept right on growing, with 9 manufacturers, 3 of them Dodge concerns. Dodge Brothers at 112 Merrimack, E.P. Dodge at 21 Pleasant Street, and N.D. Dodge and Bliss Company on Tracy Place. A whopping 21 boots and shoemakers made the 1894-95 directory, although it's not precisely clear what distinguished a maker from a manufacturer. Either way, shoe entrepreneurs were setting up everywhere in Newburyport. In 1891, John L. Dodge died, but sons Chauncey and Harry carried on the business and had started the Dodge Brothers in 1888. It became a large maker of ladies' shoes and slippers well into the 1920s, and possibly into the 30s until a strike in 1933 crippled the shoe industry. The Dodge Brothers filed for bankruptcy at some point, but when is unclear. Unfortunately, many of those records were discarded when my grandfather's house on Toppins Lane was sold in 1978. The Dodge Company specialized in women's and children's shoes and slippers, although detailed information about the styles is somewhat hard to come by. But here's a little bit. Showing the style of the day, an ad for the Plaza Pump in 1919 edition of the Sunshine News displayed a picture of a sharp-toed and bejeweled lady's shoe with high heels. The ad from the Sunshine Factory of the Nathan D. Dodge Shoe Company crowed, "Our Plaza Pump was successfully displayed at the Milwaukee Style Show. It was called the real hit of the show. Clearly, the shoes were stylish, as workers would complain during the 1933 strike that constantly changing novelty shoes required considerable extra work, deserving of higher pay. According to the Newburyport News, on August 8, 1891, as excerpted by former Newburyport Public Library employee Ron Irving, and I quote, Nathan D. Dodge & Son was manufacturing plain slippers to be sold at 74 cents to $1.50 and Oxfords to be sold for $1 to $3, as well as manufacturing Theo ties, Grecians, Elites, Baden-Badens, Elysians, and others in ooze, which is a type of leather, cloth, bronze, and satins. Irving excerpted many years of the News and the Herald concerning the Dodge enterprises. They covered strikes, fires, accidents, layoffs, and the politically active Elisha. The News reported on April 29, 1895, E.P. Dodge to use lasting machines. New methods displaces 15 men. Perhaps given their national market, primarily in the East and Midwest, very few shoe manufacturers bought ads in the directories, where some description of their products might be present. In perusing 10 directories between 1874 and 1942, I discovered one Nathan D. Dodge ad pushing its fine slippers in its retail store at 71.5 State Street, and one from Burley and Stevens advertising its Goodyear rubber soles and McKay Stitch specialties. Elisha died just shy of his 55th birthday from pneumonia on September 30, 1902. Author and Newburyport historian John J. Currier, who lavishly eulogized him at his memorial service, summed up the father of shoe manufacturing in his tome, History of Newburyport, 1764-1905. I quote, For 35 years, Mr. Dodge was interested in establishing and developing the shoe industry in Newburyport. He was one of the first to combine the many parts of shoe manufacturing under one roof and under one management and the care of one man. Others who follow owe much to the example set by him as one of the pioneers in the manufacture of shoes on a large scale. Post E.P. Dodge, the shoe industry in Newburyport had yet to hit stride. There were 12 boot and shoe manufacturers in the 1904-05 directory, 17 boot and shoe makers, 2 heel makers, and 2 counter makers. One of them was Bracket Heel, whose nameplate today adorns the front entrance to the large Prince Place factory built by Nathan D. and Elisha Dodge. The handsome brick building presently houses million-dollar condominiums. At its peak, the complex of factories anchored by 21 Pleasant Street and the Prince Place factory, and bounded by Tracy Place, Prince Place, and Hales Court, employed as many as 1,500 workers. In 1919, the complex, or at least 117,000 square feet of it, was sold by the E.P. Dodge Trust to shoe manufacturer W.D. Hanna. Add in the Dodge brothers, who started up on Merrimack Street, and the number of Dodge employees rises to nearly 2,000. If the numbers of listings is any indication, the shoe industry in Newburyport peaked in 1914 and 15, with 15 shoe manufacturers and 7 heel, counters, trimmings, and remnant manufacturers. Subsequently, the Dodge brothers, according to my 85-year-old uncle, made army belts, canteen holsters, and possibly other stitched goods for the World War I effort. By 1924, the shoe industry in revenue was in decline, according to an industrial survey conducted by the Newburyport News to attract commerce to Newburyport. Indeed, shoe revenues had dropped from $8.39 million in 1919 to $5.9 million in 1924. During the same period, capital invested was almost halved. Wages paid out declined less precipitously, from $1.78 million to $1.54 million. According to the survey, and I quote, Newburyport specializes in women's turn shoes. The shoe trade looks to Newburyport for the latest style ideas. Frequently, 10 to 15,000 pairs of shoes are shipped out of the city each day, end quote. Indeed, shoe revenues in Newburyport in 1924 were double all the other industries combined in the city, which the survey dubbed the gateway to the north. More alarming, Newburyport economically was headed down. Industrial revenues declined from $20.6 million in 1919 to $11.99 million by 1924. During that period, a recession had taken hold as the economy transitioned from wartime to peacetime. Still, 15 manufacturers and 5 heel and counter concerns soldiered on. The survey might not have been the last word on the local shoe industry's health in the 1920s. According to the 1930 Massachusetts History of Industries, Newburyport shoe revenues rebounded to $7.9 million in 1927, with 60 shoe-related firms operating in the city, many more than were ever listed in the annual directories. Even so, the die had been cast. If the decline had not already begun, it would soon, and some of the wounds were self-inflicted. The Dodge brothers, according to my uncle, failed to embrace adhesives and instead stuck, pun intended, with more expensive stitching. Styles changed rapidly, influenced heavily in the 20s by the discovery of King Tut's tomb in 1922. Tut mania was all the rage in glamorous Egyptian styles for women, and strikes didn't help. Major blows in 1933 and 1934 just about finished off the booming shoe industry in Newburyport. Workers, numbering 1,500 from 7 Newburyport factories, struck on March 10, 1933, according to W. Lloyd Warner's The Social System of the Modern Factory. In the throes of the Depression, annual wages had dropped from $1,332 a year to $924. Workers also spent time in factories with no pay as they waited for orders to materialize. The workers were represented by a loosely knit union, which after a month of striking won recognition and some wage increases. The workers, 40% of them women, returned to work on Monday, April 9th, jubilant that they had prevailed, but at what cost? 9 manufacturers, a heel and a pattern company, were still listed as operating in the city in the 1935-36 directory, but by 1942, the number of manufacturers had dwindled to 2 and 1 supplier concern. The big names, Dodge, Brackett, Hanna, Bliss, Learned, and Perry, were gone. Newburyport's shoe industry was dying. The other big blow came on May 19, 1934, when a suspected firebug, as they were called in those days, lit up the Dodge Brothers factory at 112 Merrimack Street. The building was a total loss, as was the George A. Learned Company factory next door, then occupied by the Fisher Shoe Company. The blaze destroyed 20 buildings, including many nearby homes. The area looked like a war zone and attracted 125,000 gawkers in the days that followed, according to a 2009 story in the Newburyport News. Consider that 9 out of 10 families in Newburyport had a member working in the shoe factories, according to a 2012 Newburyport News article by the late historian John Legoulis. The fire threw 500 workers out on the street. The firebug was never caught, although it's reasonable to suspect that the arsonist may have harbored resentment from the strike 13 months prior. The fire signaled that this once vibrant industry was flaming out. By the time my grandfather wrote his cordwainer paper in 1960, 2 shoe manufacturers were still hanging on in Newburyport. The irony is that Massachusetts still produced more shoes than any other U.S. state, and I quote from his paper, Massachusetts in 1959 led the nation with approximately 102,500,000 pairs of shoes made, an increase of 6.7% over 1958. Maine retained 5th place in production, while New Hampshire was 6th. New England during 1959 made 250 million pairs and accounted for 1/3 of the entire national production, he wrote. Strikes, fires, competition, and technology shifts hastened the end of shoe manufacturing in Newburyport, but its demise was inevitable. New England's claim to shoemaking primacy in 1960 is but a memory for the few who care. Capitalism ran its course in shoemaking, as it has in many U.S. industries during the past half-centuries: TVs, computers, autos, steels, and appliances, to name a few. Learning the lessons of its past is instructive, but can't reverse the ravages of competition. This long ago and often overlooked chapter in Newburyport's history spawned innovation and acrimony, created wealth for a precious few, and defined the local social strata. Next time you walk past the impressive edifice that is 21 Pleasant Street, or the Brackett Hill condos on Prince Place, Imagine the sounds and smells coming through the open windows a century ago on a hot July day. That was the shoe industry of Newburyport.
In the beginning, the French were satisfied with the salaries they received when they arrived in Newburyport. The shoe factory owners found them to be hard workers and in most cases were not as prone as the Irish were to stir up trouble, especially over unions. The French were more docile and pleased with what they had in contrast to what they had had in Canada. They were more willing to send their children to work than others were. For all these reasons, they kept more to themselves and concentrated on the needs of their church. Employers preferred them to the other, more demanding groups. The workers were always concerned about their jobs. The workers' fears that machines would eliminate jobs were not unfounded. From the Herald, September 7, 1886, a new shaving machine in the M.D. Dodge factory saves the labor of 6 men. From the Daily News on April 29, 1895, quote, E.P. Dodge to use lasting machines. New method displaces 15 men. The rapidity of style changes in shoes, especially women's shoes, necessitated speed in manufacturing and a ready adaptability to change. This resulted in rush jobs and long layoff periods causing instability of employment in the shoe shops. An item in the Daily News on August 1, 1902, described some of the changes. Women's Oxford shoes were being made with Louis XV heels and ties. Hose was initiated. Tie shoes were growing in popularity over button shoes. By 1902, the craze for Louis XV heels had begun to abate. They had reached a height of 3 inches. Cuban heels were also high. Health addicts decried the use of high heels, but fashion dictated the demand, and high heels remained in demand. An article in the News on April 28, 1902, showed how important shoes were to the well-dressed man. Quote, no well-dressed man would dream of wearing a pair of shoes not made to order at $15 to $18 a pair and has trees for every pair. His shoes are never polished but boned. A man who leads an active social life can spend $750 a year on shoes. Given a multiplier for inflation of about 18 times, the shoes would cost $275 to $325 a pair in 1995 dollars, and the total annual expenditure would be over $13,000 in 95 dollars. By 1908, the younger set was wearing velvet socks with tan shoes. Fashion became harmful in 1911 when women's shoes made of the breast feathers of hummingbirds became the latest fad. One can only imagine how many hummingbirds would have to be slaughtered to cover the feet of a woman. In December of 1908, a letter to the editor of the News strongly asserted the right of men to organize a union without interference from the employer. He claimed that the management of the Dodge Brothers Company and B.E. Cole Company intimidated employees by firing them because of their membership in a union. Practices such as these impeded events by the workers to unionize the shops. A strike at the George Learned Company in 1913 began when the company refused to accede to demands of the unions that they discharge non-union members. A party of 10 Italians arrived to take the Greek strikers' places at the Learned Company. Manufacturers often exacerbated inter-ethnic hostilities by using strikebreakers of a different ethnic background. On August 25, 1914, the News reported that 60 lasters went out on strike at the Learned Company rather than work under a Greek foreman. Workers at Bliss & Company went on strike in 1916, claiming that they were discriminated against because of their ethnicity. A conference was called in which they were promised equal treatment. Differences in language, culture, and religion are counted for some of the tensions prevalent in that period. It would take time, but by mid-century, much of this had passed and most were integrated into the community. In addition to functioning as workplaces, factories often served as social venues. In March of 1920, through the courtesy of Superintendent Amesworth, the Question Club was formed by 10 men at the Hannah Shoe Factory to discuss questions related to civic history, the duties, the privileges, and the rights of citizenship, and current events. The Question Club met at 4:45 to 5:45 Monday and Thursday afternoons. In addition, most factories sponsored sports teams, dances, and held an annual summer day at the beach with free refreshments. As time went on, however, when jobs were not as available and a second generation had arrived, they began to realize that they might have to take a more active role in the regulation of salaries and physical conditions in the shoe factories. Interviews with Newburyporters whose lives were linked to the shoe shops illustrate the need for a change. Donald Shampoo. My father worked in the shoe shops while I was growing up. I can't say anything good about them. Not only was the pay low, but there was no security to the job. You worked 3 months, had 3 months off, worked another 3, then was out of work again. It was all tied up with seasonal orders for shoes. When he was laid off, my father worked at any job he could find, such as delivering milk, selling insurance, etc. My uncle worked for Swift & Company, and every Saturday he dropped off 5 pounds of Hamburg with us, pretending it was extra that they had. We ate that, a family of 6, for the whole week. Hazel Cody was 96 years old when Tom Horth and Jean Doyle interviewed her several years ago. She worked at most of the shops at one time or another. She worked at the Dodge Shoe Company before the fire. When the strike came, she went to Haverhill to work. Quote, I worked 5 1/2 days and made $12. When working, no talking was allowed. You were allowed to go to the bathroom once. You could be fired for even a minor offense. Once I spilled some cleaning fluid on my stockings. Not wanting to spoil them, I washed them in the sink and hung them out on the windowsill to dry. My supervisor was walking by and saw them. She fired me on the spot. Shoe shops worked 6 months a year. I could charge groceries at Schwartz's store on Orange Street. I paid it back when I worked. Bill Plant, former editor of the Daily News, had many stories about the shoe shops. As a boy, he often walked the picket lines with his mother. Quote, my mother was working at the Sunshine Factory on Monroe Street one afternoon when the foreman came in to tell the women that they had received a rush order. Everyone could go home at 5 p.m., but had to be back by 6 p.m. The doors would be locked at that time. Anyone not there would be fired the next day. My mother was just a few minutes late, but the doors were locked. She saw that a man was working in the boiler room in the cellar and tapped on the window. He had no way of letting her in by the door, but he let her go in through the window and she was able to retain her position. In a presentation to the Monday Evening Club, May 14, 1992, Bill Plant told how at age 33, his mother, fed up with the ill treatment she and her fellow workers were getting from management at Bill Dodge's Sunshine Shoe Factory, and from what the women called, quote, fresh behavior of male supervisors and bellboys. She marched the women out the door, down High Street to City Hall, and formed the Women's Local of the Shoe Workers Union. She was elected president. Addressing the group, Bill Plant said, quote, I report this because it helped shape my early appreciation for the social and political problems attending women's issues in our unfolding society.
At age 12, I walked picket lines with her. At age 14, I helped her at weekly whist parties at the Union Hall, one of the means of raising funds to support union activities. For some, a major grievance was low wages. Bessie Jones, wife of Sam, a shoe worker, said, quote, "Wages are awful now. When a girl 2 years ago would be earning $25 a week, nowadays she's lucky if she gets 10. I know lots of girls who only get 4. People are lucky if they only get 10 cents an hour. If a girl is living with her family, it's not so bad. She can get along. But when girls are alone, I don't see how they live. They are forcing our young women into immorality." This last accusation was aimed toward one particular foreign factory owner who forced, under threat of job loss, some of the girls into giving him sexual favors. All this made the workers ready for the strike that broke out the following spring. Yankee City had had periodic strikes of shoe operatives in previous years, but there had never been a permanent union in the community. One former Yankee City shoe manufacturer explained that when organizers came down and talked to some of his workers, he had immediately offered raises and contracts to his workers because he thought that unions were a, quote, bad thing. Most of his workers signed the contract and declined to unionize. One reason why unions had not been successful was that the South Enders, who were so numerous among the workers, would not join. They would rather have steady work all the time and not fight. This was particularly true of the French workers. But finally, even they began to listen. Small merchants were sympathetic to the workers for 2 reasons. They too were lower and lower middle class people, interested in the welfare of others of comparable social status. They sold their merchandise almost exclusively to members of the working class, and they had to show sympathy for them to keep their trade. During the 1930s, Lloyd Warner and his associates compiled a 6-volume set of books entitled the Yankee City series that dealt with the cultural, social, and economic status of Newburyport during the 1930s and 1940s. Volume 5 concerned itself with the social organization of a modern factory. The authors selected the strike of 1933 to show the crisis that existed in the relations of management and workers. Warner described the scene as follows, quote, "On a cold March day in the worst year of the Depression, all the workers in all of the factories of the principal industry of Yankee City walked out. They struck with little or no warning, struck with such impact that all the factories closed and no worker remained at his bench. Management had said their workers would never strike because the workers of Yankee City were sensible and dependable, and had proved by a long, peaceful history that they would always stay on the job. Union men outside the city said the Yankee City workers would not strike because Yankee City had never been and could not be organized, and therefore the shoe workers of Yankee City were obstinate and, quote, always stupid enough to play management games. Most of the townspeople said workers would never strike, but foreigners and Yankees of 10 generations, men and women, very old and very young, Jews and Gentiles, Catholics and Protestants, the whole heterogeneous mass of workers left their benches and in a few hours wiped out most of the basic production from which Yankee City earned its living. Not only did they strike and soundly defeat management, but they organized themselves, joined an industrial union, and became some of its strongest members. The strike began on March 10 and lasted until April 6th. The battle was fought between the owners of 7 factories and 1,500 workers. The mayor, who was Gaydon Morrill at the time, granted the strikers free use of City Hall for their meetings. This was a surprising turn of events for Gaydon Morrill. He was a former shoe manufacturing plant owner and a member of the elite upper class in the city. Throughout the strike, the mayor had tried to be neutral. After further negotiations, the manufacturers accepted the union, and the strikers accepted arbitration by the state board on the matter of wages. Both sides claimed victory, but the prevailing opinion was that labor came out on top. As conditions improved in the industry, the influence of the union declined. The union did, however, perform an effective service. It demanded adherence to regular working hours, and it helped maintain established rates of pay and equalization of the pay of different workers in the slacker periods. In 1997, in the North Shore magazine, Bill Plant recalled his days in the shoe shop. Quote, "It is the summer of 1939, and I am up on the second floor pulling shoe lasts for 25 cents an hour minimum wage, which I cannot break because it's the best I can do is 2 cents an hour at 9 cents a case. I put my hand down into the bin to grab a last and came up with a broken Coke bottle sticking in the palm. So I pull it out, use a handkerchief for a wrap, and walk into the office to quit." The minimum wage law passed by Congress in 1938 was welcomed by the shoe workers. From now on, they would get at least 35 cents an hour. This was in sharp contrast to what some workers had been receiving. Massachusetts dropped from 47% of U.S. shoe production in 1899 to 17% in 1948. In 1919, there were 114,000 shoe workers in New England. By 1948, that figure was down to 79,000. Production continued to fluctuate in the coming years. Not until the latter half of the century would the shoe industry disappear entirely from Newburyport.
As the years passed, the concept of the French parochial school gradually became obsolete. Children no longer wanted to use their parents' language and preferred the public school. Probably hastened by the end of World War II, the tight French community gradually dispersed, moving out of the South, and as second and third generation family members moved away from their original neighborhoods and married into other ethnic groups or into other religious affiliations. The original reasons for the establishment of St. Louis disappeared. The congregation contracted slowly, although those that stayed were faithful and loyal to its ongoing tradition. In the 70s, the French-speaking Mass at 10:15 ended. Father Dacier began a restoration fund that was continued in the 80s with the removal of the front building to Liberty Street and construction of a front entrance. A new pipe organ was installed as the restorations continued. In 1995, the church celebrated its 90th anniversary with William Plant as the main speaker. The words on the bulletin said it all. Let us gather as God's family and rejoice in this joyous celebration. Despite their hard work, it was obvious that the end was in sight. In 1997, one pastor was named for both parishes, and on January 1, 1999, St. Louis Parish reunited with the Immaculate Conception Parish. The reason for its closing was that vocational callings had diminished. Many fewer men and women were deciding to devote their lives to the church. The result was a severe shortage of priests and nuns. Priests that were available were slated for larger churches. Economic pressures on the greater church demanded reduction of church buildings. Thus, after close to 100 years of service, St. Louis de Gonzaga closed its doors, leaving a void that for many would never be forgotten. I interviewed Ellen Marcoux O'Keefe at that time when she spoke of what this loss meant to her. Although she married an Irishman, she stayed at St. Louis all her life, contributing financially and participating in all the spiritual as well as money-making activities. Her parting words summed up her feelings. It has been a tough year. I lost my husband, my mother, and several aunts. When I finally began to sit back and collect my thoughts, I realized that in truth, I lost all my family when the French church closed. These were the people I had associated most closely with all these years. I saw the same people in church on Sunday. We served on committees together or sang in the choir. Now it has all changed. We have no committees. Some of the people have gone to other churches. I have nothing against the Immaculate Conception Church. They have tried to make us feel welcome, but it isn't the same. I feel sad every time I think of what I have lost. Most important, however, to our story was the ability of these parishioners to not only keep their faith, but also play an important part in the development of Newburyport. William Plant was the epitome of that person. Having worked his way up from reporter to executive editor and general manager of the Daily News, he set an example for others to follow. Among his many accomplishments were his drive to save and revitalize downtown Newburyport and his taking on the leadership of the group that created the Industrial Green. He was an advocate of a free press and known as one who went out of his way to help others climb the ladder to success. Time does not allow us to name all that found success, but the following played a part. Norman Jutras, who started out as a manager of Grant's store in Newburyport and went on to build his own appliance store in Seabrook. Dr. Arthur Plouffe, a dentist who, along with his wife Annetta, played a leading role in many community affairs. James Croto, who served as a city councilor for 5 terms from 1958 to 1967. Boot Chenard, who went on to Boston College and later served as a high school coach in Salem and Newburyport. Boots, having lived into his 90s, reminds us of the past through his many articles in the Daily News. Marshal Joseph Garand of the Newburyport Police Department. Ben Benoit Richard, Department Fire Chief and owner of Richard's Garage. Robert Sharon, who, after attending a mission at the French church, gave his life the next day on the Thresher submarine as it plunged to its depths on April 10th, 1963. Our heart goes out to all who lost their church. We welcome those who left Canada and made their homes in Newburyport. Their presence and the others who have followed have helped make Newburyport what it is today.